Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Zenshuji 100th Anniversary Lecture Series today. I'm Reverend Shumio Kojima, head priest of this Zenshuji Soto Mission. Year 2022, this year, is a 100th anniversary year for us. This Zenshuji is the first Zen temple in North America, established to 1922. 100 years ago, that was almost same situations that after the pandemic of the Spanish flu. It happened 1918, the 4 years after. Now, 3 years after the COVID started, the almost same situations. In November of this year, we're going to celebrate this 100th anniversary with Jukaiye, a precept retreat ceremony and celebration events. But prior to this event, we planned lecture series to review the histories and to know about what is a Soto Zen from the many views. And especially our Zazenkai hosted to think about what we want to hear, what we want to know. That is the start, beginning of this lecture series. Especially Dr. Lon Kurashige, he entire work make this happen. Thank you, Lon. And now we are going to have, this is the first lecture with Duncan Williams. He is my old friend. He's now still coming in, still driving to come over here. So we are still waiting. So could you keep a little bit wait for him? And we're going to start a little later. But let me introduce Dr. Lon Kurashige. Could you come up here?
So, thank you, Kojima-sensei. As he said, we're looking forward to Duncan's talk today because this really is a momentous year for us in 2022 at Zenshuji. As he said, it's the 100th anniversary, and this is the first lecture for this series of events. We're calling it Talks and Conversations to commemorate this auspicious year. I don't know if many of you know, but certainly those of you who come here maybe might not even know. But Zenshuji was not just what was certainly the first branch of Soto Zen school in Japan in North America. There was a temple in Hawaii that was founded a few years before, and in fact, it was the same founder, Hosen Isobe, founded the temple in Hawaii, which was the first in the Americas. And then he founded this temple, Zenshuji, in Los Angeles. And then from here, he went up and founded Sokoji Temple in San Francisco. So he's quite an important figure for us. And there was a book written about him and about his adventures founding these temples. And so as part of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary, we're translating that book. It was written in Japanese. And we're translating that book and we're publishing it as part of the temple newsletter, but also we'll gather all of the chapters together and have it be a whole book about the founding of this temple. And so please look forward to that. So as Kojima-sensei said, I'm Lon Kurashige, and I am a co-president of Zenshuji's Zazenkai. And so as part of that, we're sponsoring, part of the Zazenkai, we're sponsoring this lecture series. And I want to make an announcement for next month's event. It'll be on February 5th, on a Saturday. 5 o'clock. All our events start at 5 o'clock. And that will only be online. And we do it on both Zoom and Facebook Live. And both of those, the link for Facebook Live is available on the Zenshuji website. And also on the website, there'll be an email address to send to get the Zoom link. And that's going to be called Asian Americans and the Zen Boom. And it's going to include sort of the beginnings of the spread of Soto Zen in North America in San Francisco in the 1950s and 1960s. And that will feature Professor Dana Takagi from UC Santa Cruz and Roshi Jaksho Kwong from Sonoma Mountain Zen Center. And also we'll have a short video of Dr. Kazumitsu Wako Kato, who is one of our temple priests and who's been a long-time teacher here at Zenshuji. So please look forward to that event and join us on February 5th. Okay, I want to thank Kojima Sensei, of course, for making this all possible. He was the one who came up with this whole idea for a lecture series. And to Atsuko Kubota, who is another president of Zazenkai, who has made the beautiful flyers that you see. So thank you, Atsuko. To John Flores, who is another president of Zazenkai, Eric Kuramoto, Kevin Hudnell, who's recording this or for a video we're going to shoot or edit, and many, many others who have helped us make this event possible. Okay, so now to introduce our speaker, Duncan Ryūken Williams, who is my colleague at the University of Southern California. I teach in the history department. Duncan teaches in religion. He was ordained as a Soto Zen Buddhist priest at Kotakuji Temple in Nagano, Japan, and I believe Kojima Sensei was there as well. In 1993, and then he served as a Buddhist chaplain at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in 2000. Currently, he is chair of USC's School of Religion, and he's professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, and director of the USC Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Cultures. Williams is the author of the LA Times bestseller American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, published in 2019, and it's about Buddhism and the World War II Japanese-American internment. And he'll speak, as I'm sure a lot of his information will come from that book today, for his talk today. Duncan's other books, The Other Side of Zen, published in 2005, and he's edited many, many other collections, scholarly collections about race, religion, and American belonging. He is currently co-curator of an exhibit, Sutra and Bible, Faith and the World War II Japanese-American Incarceration, that will be available in opening at JANM, Japanese-American National Museum, just down the block from here in February, in next month, February 2002. So without further ado, I'm going to give you over to Duncan. Sorry, let me just say, he's talking today about Zen at the half century, Zenshuji Temple and the World War II Japanese-American incarceration. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lon, for that kind introduction. Let me just first greet the Buddha. And of course, on this occasion, the 100th anniversary of Zenshuji Soto Mission, I want to very much thank the abbot of the temple, Reverend Kojima Shumyo, and then Lon and the other leaders of the Zazenkai who have been organizing this wonderful series to commemorate this important occasion. I think before I want to go into why I think it's so important that we're celebrating this 100th anniversary, I'd like to just take a moment of reflection or moment of silence. I think many of you know that in the last 24 hours, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is belongs to our same Zen lineage, but of course from the Vietnamese tradition, passed away. I think I was 19 years old when I did a 7-day retreat with 35 other people with Thich Nhat Hanh every day, giving a Dharma talk about the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the Keihon Kyo. And even though I'm ordained and affiliated with the Japanese Soto Zen Buddhist lineage, I've always been so impressed with how he was able to translate the Buddhist teachings and the Zen Buddhist teachings and mindfulness and engage Buddhism in so many interesting ways for the West. And so if we could just take one moment of silence and reflection. Thank you. I'm just going to read a poem of his to kind of start us off. No coming, no going, no after, no before. I hold you close, I release you to be free. I am in you, and you are in me. It's one of his, I think, wonderful poems that talks about, I think, such a key teaching he delivered around interconnectedness. He's sometimes called it interbeing with each other. And that notion of interbeing, of being in community with each other, of Sangha, I think, to me, that's the beginnings of the story of Zenshuji Soto Mission and the 100th anniversary. I believe, there'll be some speakers in the series who will talk about the foundations and the origins of this temple. Others will be talking about what's been going on more recently. But I'm going to give a talk today. And if Kojima, you could put the slide first. I'm calling it, I slightly changed the title, Mid-Century Zen. And it's a important, I wanted to focus on that kind of middle period of the temple's history, because during World War II, there was, I think, a very key moment for the history of this temple, a crisis moment, when there was every possibility that this temple would have disappeared. Its leadership arrested by the FBI, its temple members taken to incarceration sites far from Los Angeles, and the temple nearly having to be sold because it couldn't keep up with the mortgage and so forth, and the government nearly seized it. And so there was this moment when if things were not done a certain way, we would certainly not be here today celebrating 100 years. So I want to talk a little bit about this mid-century moment of this temple's history. If I could go to maybe the next slide. If this is a little clearer, you would see a photograph of Reverend Kenko Yamashita on the Taiyomaru. He was a picture of him making his first trip across the Pacific from Japan, from his original Gifu prefecture to this country. And it's him and his wife in a photograph. And the other photograph would be a photograph of him in a World War II internment camp in New Mexico called the Santa Fe internment camp. And I think I met him first when I was in graduate school. I think it was 1997 or something like that. He was already, I think, 87 years old. And at that time, he was the abbot of this temple and had served many years as the bishop of Soto Zen North America. And I got to talk to him a little bit about his World War II experience, but he didn't say that much at the time. And then, but over time, I came to learn something about his experience during World War II and the experience of many other Zenshuji affiliated priests as well as temple membership, and certainly came to notice, despite the fact that many people in that era didn't want to talk about what happened, it was a very, very jarring, disruptive moment in the life of the 100 years of this temple. He mentioned in several different places, if we go to the next slide, this is Reverend Kenko Yamashita when he was younger, Buddhist priest. At the time when Pearl Harbor happened, December 7, 1941, he was a 28-year-old Buddhist priest here at Zenshuji, but also he taught a Japanese language school and kendo, as you can see. And there's a small excerpt there in Japanese from one of his kind of memoirs called Donguri Korokoro. And he talked a little bit about, in that book, as well as in other oral histories and so forth, about what happened on the day of Pearl Harbor. 123 Hewitt Street here. He actually, on that day, happened to be not here, but over at, there was a Zenshuji affiliated language school in Riverside, where he was teaching. And he and his wife were, and at that time, 6-month-old child were all there. And he was giving some Japanese lessons and some Dharma lessons for the kids when he learned about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he would come back later that day to the temple and find that many community leaders had been taken away already by the FBI. It would take, because he was kind of young and therefore like a junior priest, he wasn't targeted immediately. And so it would take some months before one day, some weeks, or even a couple months later, he was here at 123 Hewitt Street, giving a Dharma talk, chanting the morning service chanting, while the FBI was waiting for him to finish. At that time, they came up to him and said, "We are going to take you and your wife." And the reason they were interested in his wife was that she was also a teacher at the Japanese language school. And being a Buddhist priest, being a Japanese language school teacher, being the head of a Nihonjinkai, or like a Japanese association, or a Kenjinkai, a prefectural association, being the head of a Japanese kind of like business association, any kind of leaders of the community were subject to suspicion, thought to be a threat to American national security, and to be arrested. This is before the mass incarceration of people on the West Coast. They targeted certain kinds of people. And because he had this 6-month-old child with him, he was like, who's going to take care of this 6-month-old? And he comments on the fact that the FBI agent kind of didn't quite realize what their arrest warrant was about to do to their family. And so the FBI agent in charge, crossed out his wife's name from the arrest warrant. And that's how it was that he was taken away to a series, first to LA County Jail, the Tuna Canyon Detention Station, Santa Fe, I mentioned earlier that photo, Santa Fe internment camp in New Mexico, Lordsburg internment camp in New Mexico, and finally a place called Crystal City internment camp in Texas, where at the end of the war he would reunite with his family. And his second child is in fact born in that Texas camp before he was, at the end of the war, deported to Japan, where he would spend 10 years before coming back to Los Angeles and serving as bishop. And some of you who are old enough may, remember him too. So I start with this story of somebody of our own lineage, of our own community, who went through something where certainly for his family, the family was separated from each other during the war. They were put in different types of confinement sites, internment camps, concentration, different kind of camps. And it was a not easy time for one family, but if you can imagine, this temple had many such families. And so I wanted to use most of my time today to talk a little bit about what was going on for people associated with the Zenshuji Soto Mission around that mid-century point, where in some ways, by the time 1941 had come around, Japanese Americans had been in the United States for almost 70 years, and multiple generations had been, coming to temple, and yet they were thought to be a danger because not of their race, but because of their religion. So I'm going to hone in a little bit on that. It was their Buddhism that also made them a threat in the eyes of intelligence agencies, maybe the media, and even the general public, politicians, people like that at that time. So if I could go to the next slide, please. So this is just very quickly, I mentioned, Crystal City, Texas, Santa Fe, New Mexico. There was a whole dozens of these confinement sites, some run by the US Army, some run by the Department of Justice, some run by a civilian agency called the War Relocation Authority. There were 10 big concentration camps run by the WRA all across the nation. And if I could go to the next slide. But I think one of the most striking things, and this is why I started with the story of Reverend Kenko Yamashita of our temple, Zenshuji, was that the very first person arrested by the FBI right after Pearl Harbor, even before the smoke had cleared at Pearl Harbor, 30 minutes before martial law was declared, the very first person arrested was Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba of the Honpa Honganji Buddhist Temple in Honolulu, the largest Buddhist temple in that city. The second person arrested was, I think, Taihei, one of our Soto Zen temples. The Buddhist priest of that temple was arrested. And then, you'd think like maybe they'd arrest consular officials, or because there's a naval attack, maybe some, fishermen's associate, but Buddhist priests, why were they the first people the government thought they needed to target, to arrest? So to answer that question, we need to actually take one step back, more towards the time of when Zenshuji Soto Mission was founded, in the decades prior to the Pearl Harbor attack. And if I could go to the next slide, please. So this is not a Sotoshi priest, but a Jodoshi priest on Hawaiian Islands, and it's his basic personnel record for the enemy alien file and his warrant of arrest. All of these people that were arrested had these presidential warrant, it would either have J. Edgar Hoover's signature from the FBI or whatever, but given by authority of the president to, in a time of national emergency, to arrest people that were enemy aliens considered a threat to national security. And so these people were picked up, you can see they being treated as criminals, and they do the fingerprints. And if I go to the next slide, you can see that this is his FBI case file card, and he's categorized as somebody in what's called Group A, individuals believed to be most dangerous who in all probability should be interned in event of war. So that's what Reverend Yamashita from this temple was also categorized as, people who were for the duration of the war. He was never paroled out of the Department of Justice camps and Army camps. The people who were considered so dangerous that they needed to be kind of separated and detained as long as the war with Japan was going on. And on the Hawaiian Islands, Buddhist priests and Shinto priests as a category of person was considered Group A. On the mainland, it was a little bit different. But as a category of person, Buddhist priests were somehow thought to be a threat, not only to what makes America America, but as a kind of military threat. And I want to kind of get into that in a moment. If I go to the next slide. My research has shown that this idea that Buddhism and Buddhist priests, let's say, and also Shinto priests as well, but not Japanese Christian ministers, were not categorized in the same way. Where does that idea come from? It comes from this much longer history, as far back as, in fact, the 19th century, when it was thought that America is essentially a white and Christian nation. And to be more precise, an Anglo-Protestant nation. Benjamin Franklin didn't think Germans could be real Americans, you know. There's that kind of Anglo meaning British, and Protestant meaning Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics were not considered in these early decades as welcome, you know. And so as time went on, though, Irish and Germans and, you know, they all became white, kind of, you know, in that category. And then Protestants of different variations and even Catholics ultimately would be considered part of a kind of Christian nation. But what about Asians or Japanese immigrants and the fact that majority of them, you know, people that came to be the first founders and members of Zenshuji were coming from prefectures that were probably over 95 or 96% Buddhist, you know, and very few people, even today in Japan, Christians constitute less than 1% of the population. And certainly back then, it was certainly less than 1% of the population. So it was a time when just by being from this region of the world as an immigrant, you were already kind of outside the realm of what would be considered American. And this was made very clear with the first large group of Buddhists in America, which were the Chinese immigrants. They came to California, Hawaii and California prior to the Japanese. And at a certain point, the public, the media, the politicians of that time, the intelligence agencies even, viewed them as a threat to the nation. In part with this idea of America as in its kind of essential identity is, you know, white and Christian, it meant that they would talk about the need to build a wall. It sounds kind of familiar, right? but you can see in this Harper's Weekly illustration from 1870, this idea is old. You need to build a wall. This is like symbolically across the Pacific to keep a group of people that, you know, are not welcome, do not engender a sense of belonging in America, to keep them out. And there were these fears of it. You can see this pamphlet from 1873, a Chinese invasion and the establishment of a heathen Chinese despotism in San Francisco. That was the kind of fear. And that word heathen, it implied that these were non-Christians that would pollute this beautiful Christian nation, right? And so ultimately, I think, as many of you know, in the 1880s, early 1880s, after a series of discussions, a Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal immigration law that targeted one group of people as unwelcome in America, where Senate debates about the fact that this was a non-Christian group, a heathen group, was often raised. The slur word at the time was the heathen Chinese, this kind of racially unassimilable and religiously unacceptable group to be kept out of America, to be excluded. So this idea is old. But if I could go to the next slide. In the case of the Japanese, you can see that idea of this yellow peril, or this group of people that was considered perilous, a threat, was even during the World War II kind of conflated, where you can see the Kamakura Buddha sitting atop a military tank with a samurai figure behind it, this kind of merging of this idea of the Japanese with militarism, with the Buddhism as its kind of front face. So that idea certainly is an old one, but something that people like Reverend Kinko Yamashita of our temple had to face. They had to kind of contend with this general idea that these were dangerous people. And you can see in this other Harper's Weekly one, this is from an earlier time, but there's a brightly lit nation or territory underneath a Christian cross, and this looming cloud of black clouds of ominous thing with a Buddha in the middle of it. So this is the kind of atmosphere that members of this temple had to contend with as they would come to learn that they would be unwelcome, not only in terms of immigration. Japanese would be, after the Chinese, included in the 1924 Immigration Act, where all persons of Asiatic descent were, an Asiatic exclusion zone were targeted as unwelcome. And so members of this temple also, started by an immigrant community, having kids here as American citizens, but at a certain point, there was a kind of stoppage of immigration from Japan, and this temple's character and this demography of the temple reflects what was happening in America in the 20s, 30s, and of course, by December 1941, what's happening around the country is very much affecting the life of this temple. If I could go to the next slide. And so it was that after that selective internment, the targeting of Buddhist priests and other community leaders, it was over. There was discussion around the nation about what to do with this group of people, majority of whom were Buddhist. And at that time, in 1941, Japanese Americans constituted the largest Buddhist group in America. And there was a lot of discussion about whether this group was so dangerous that it shouldn't just be the leaders, but it should be everybody of Japanese ancestry, citizen or not, infirmed grandmother or little baby, didn't matter. Everybody was considered a national security threat. President Roosevelt issued an executive order February 19, 1942 called the Executive Order 9066. He gives in that executive, it doesn't actually mention the word Japan or Japanese Americans in it, but it gives the US Army the sole discretion as to whom to exclude or what to do for the defense of the United States during a time of war. And although the United States was also at war with Germany and Italy, there was no mass incarceration of those communities. It was just the Japanese that was targeted. And I think the most telling thing about how thorough, I almost want to call it the ethnic cleansing of the West Coast was something that happened here in Los Angeles. Right here in Little Tokyo, nearby, was an orphanage run by the Marinols, and I think they're just across the street from us here at Zenshuji. And at that time, Father Hugh Lavery, the Marinol father who was running the orphanage, he directly asked one of the chief architects of this U.S. Army's process of incarcerating, force removing, and incarcerating Japanese Americans into all those camps that you saw on the map. He asked Carl Bendiston, this important, he's an army lawyer who kind of devised the plan and implementation policies of how to work out the removal of every person of Japanese ancestry. And he was asked, and at that time, if you might recall, there was a thing called the anti-miscegenation law. It was a kind of law that said people of different races, especially people who were of a non-white race, could not marry somebody legally, could not marry somebody who was white. And despite that, of course, people did have relationships across race and so forth. And the babies born, many of them were given up for adoption right here at the Marino orphanage. And so they had a bunch of these babies and 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds and 13-year-old. And the director of the orphanage asked Benison, these mixed race kids, are they too subject to Executive Order 906? Are they too, subject to going to some place unknown for a time indefinite? Are they subject to being arrested? And he said, Benison said, if they have a single drop of Japanese blood in them, I want them in camp. So that's how thorough it was. Every member of this temple, at that time, I think almost 99% of the temple membership were either Japanese nationals or Japanese American US citizens. Even if you were in a mixed marriage or family, you were off to camp. That's how thorough it was. And if I go to the next slide. And once they, from here, just across the street, at the Marino, that was one of the civil control stations. Another one for the Manzanar voluntary evacuation was at the Nishihonganji Temple, which is currently where the old part of the Japanese American National Museum is. So this neighborhood was where people from this temple and others around it were gathered, got on buses, etc., and were transported to various kinds of temporary confinement sites called, euphemistically, they were called assembly centers, where they would spend the spring, summer, and early fall of 1942. Some of them, for example, here in LA, most people ended up going to a place called Santa Anita. I think many of you may know that even today, it serves, there's a racetrack there. And people were literally put in horse stalls, places where just a few weeks earlier, there was livestock, horses, that kind of thing, and people could still smell the urine, and then they had to make their beds out of hay. It was not a great place to be put under any circumstance. But if you can imagine Reverend Yamashita's, he was, I think, happy that his wife was not taken by the FBI, but she now, without her husband, had a 6-month-old child to take care of in one of these horse stalls. And so it was that initially people went in here, and when you go to prison, you know how sometimes they check you for contraband? And at that time, the US Army that was controlling this process of getting people removed from their homes, assembling and going to these places. This is a photo of one of the assembly centers up in the Pacific Northwest. It's about 30 miles south of Seattle, called Puyallup Assembly Center. But whenever you entered a place like Puyallup or Santa Anita or any number of these assembly centers, they would check your bags. They would look for contraband. If they found a camera, for instance, that was considered, you could be spies or something. So they would confiscate that. Obviously, anything like guns, or any weapons, and so forth. That's to be kind of expected. But what was unexpected was that amongst the things that they deemed contraband was anything that had Japanese language within, printed bound books. It could be a Buddhist sutra. It could also be just a book of haiku poetry. That was considered subversive, dangerous contraband that needed to be confiscated. The only exception to this rule about Japanese language texts and books was if you had an English-Japanese language dictionary, they allowed you to keep that. Or if you had a Japanese language version of the Christian Bible, they allowed you to keep that. So what was the message that people were receiving from this temple who were going into these assembly centers? They're being told, to be American, you need to learn English and you need to be Christian. And that was not, that was very much for people who, they couldn't change their race. I suppose they could have all converted to Christianity, but they thought America was a nation of religious freedom, right? right? And so if we could go to the next slide, you can see how at least one family dealt with that. This is the family of Reverend, this is Jodo Shinshu Temple up in Portland, but the Oregon Buddhist Church, Reverend Terakawa's family, it's his daughter Hiroko playing checkers with her friend Lillian Hayashi in the Portland Assembly Center. It used to be, it still exists today in North Portland. It's the International Livestock Expo. But it's where they have, sale of cows and whatever. So that's where they went. They tried to make you can see they tried their best to make their quarters as livable as possible. But if you notice another thing, they've got a picture of the Buddha and an American flag up on their wall. So even though the government told them that their expectations of Americanness was Anglo and Protestant, Anglo in the sense not just of whiteness, but English only, they were asserting something else, that you can be fully American and Buddhist at the same time. And so if I could go to the next slide. And so it was that people survived their camp experience. If Buddhism was one of the factors that targeted them as threats, the people themselves had a different reaction. They drew on their faith. They went deeper into their Buddhism. They studied the text more in camp than before even, some people report. They took more time to do personal practice as well as collective Sangha practice in camp. And to do that, they often had to be very, very creative. One of the Soto Zen priests in one of the internment camps in New Mexico, on the bottom left of this screen, you can see this ojuzu, or prayer beads. In that camp, they had, as a kind of ration of food, 2 pieces of fruit per week. And he kept the peach pits of the rationed fruit they were given, enough so that he could string a prayer bead together. Other people, this other photo shows a altar, a shumidang, or like a Buddhist altar, being in mid-construction in the Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming, where 2 people that built the San Jose Buddhist Temple, it's a Jodo Shinshu temple in the Bay Area, the Nishiura brothers, they were master carpenters, and they helped to build the Buddhist altar for that camp so that the Sangha could reassemble again. And so there's a lot of effort that people made. I'm reminded of Dogen's teachings from the Tenzo Kyokun, the instructions to the cook about not wasting. Dogen teaches in that text that you have to, if you want to be a good tenzo or a cook, head cook in the monastery, you need to take inventory, pay attention to what ingredients you may have in the monastic kitchen. That's job kind of number 1, but not to waste anything, to use everything as best as possible, not for your own sake as a chef or something, but for the sake of all of the other practitioners in your monastery, in your Sangha, to help physically as well as spiritually nourish them, right? And that idea of kind of using what you have, what ingredient, there's that famous teaching of you can be a pretty decent chef if you have amazing, great ingredients, but a great Zen chef or cook is somebody who can take mediocre or even quite maybe some rotting cabbage and make it takwa. We have a long tradition in Zen of taking things that are not necessarily the best karmic conditions and then transforming that into something that's still helpful for other people. So I think that was one of the deep teachings that people had to manifest and actualize in camp. The thing that put the target on them, they drew on to sustain them so that Sangha could persist. And I want to now kind of shift a little bit into how the Sangha persisted, in particular with Zenshuji, because we're celebrating the 100th anniversary today. I want to talk a little bit, I mean, it's a little documents that are a little bit detailed, but I wanted to talk about them because I don't think I've ever presented on this before. And I wanted, for this particular group, Zenshuji, to know that we could very easily not be here for the 100th anniversary if it weren't for the efforts of very many people in the Sangha at that time to kind of continue the transmission of the Dharma, to continue the Sangha in its various forms. And so if I could go to the next slide, please. It says Zenshuji and the wartime storage of family treasures. And actually, if I could go to the next slide. The reason I mention this idea of storage of family treasures was that Buddhism was always a refuge for people. You know, Zenshuji Soto Mission was a refuge. It was a temple that not only refuge in the kind of deepest Buddhist sense of like sharing of the Buddha Dharma Sangha, but is also refuge from the racism of the time, a place where you could watch movies, you could have Japanese food and speak in English and Japanese. You know, it was a refuge from a world that told them you don't belong. And that was the case in all the decades since the founding, right up until World War II, and even during the war. It became a refuge in the sense of a storage place. When people were told they're going to go to camp, they were told, you're going to go to a place unknown in these remote parts of the United States. Some people from LA went as far as these camps like Jerome and Rower in Arkansas. You know, it's not close by. For a time indefinite, you don't know how long you're going. I don't know how long the war is going to last. And you're told you can take what you could carry. So if you can imagine looking in your own apartment or home, you can maybe carry one suitcase, maybe one and a half, you know. What are you going to put in there? That's why I mentioned about the ojus, you know, like some people couldn't take everything. So they would have to make that kind of thing in camp and recraft their faith in camp. And the temples became these hubs right before the war of teaching how to get perspective on what was about to happen in this new dislocation, lives being interrupted, but also very practically storing people's valuable treasures that they couldn't physically carry with them to these camps. One of the things that you see in this letter here to Reverend Daito Suzuki, he was a Buddhist priest, you know, serving Zenshuji. He was told in his camp in Gila River, Arizona, that there were some other temple members belonging to Zenshuji Mission, it says, people like Hamaguchi Masakazu, Hamaguchi Miyoko, Shintani Otozo, Yamanaka Kojiro, who were in Manzanar, a different WRA camp here in the eastern part of California, who were hoping to receive some bedding and trunks and boxes that were stored here at the temple. And so the Reverend Suzuki, one of the other Zenshuji priests, I mentioned Reverend Yamashita, but there were several others here at the time of the war. They were trying to help mediate these releases of people's things that they stored here. But in this other letter, there's this other news about what happened to this temple during the war. I can't read all of it, but I'm going to just quickly summarize, which is that there was several break-ins to the temple, and there was two big issues. One was a series of break-ins into the temple where people vandalized and looted this temple, and what to do about it. And there was a law firm that was engaged by the temple's leadership at the time, board at the time, and you can see the letterhead there, FW Catalyts and Company, that is also informing the board president of this temple that there's another big issue, which is that because these people are, away in camp and they're not making money, and like they were trying to pay off the mortgage and they're delinquent. And that the government, the WRA initially, but the US government, was in its delinquency, imminently going to take over the temple and take it away from the Sangha. So if I could go to the next slide. So this is a letter from one of the attorneys to Frank Kuwahara. I think some of you may even remember who he is, but he was in the Poston concentration camp in Arizona, and he gets this letter from LA saying, "I've not heard from you for some time with reference to the temple on Hewitt Street. I judge from the fact that I've not heard from you with reference to the tax monies that you were not in a position to raise some, I think, meaning raise the money." And he's just warning Frank Kuwahara, who was the board president of Soto Zen Mission at Zenshuji Soto Mission at the time, that it's going to be taken over by the state for that tax delinquency. And that maybe he could sell some of the furniture that was left in here by the temple members as a way to kind of raise some monies to kind of like, not fall into that place where the government takes away the temple. And then there's a note on the other side of this, which is again to Frank, this time from some of the other Zenshuji members. I'm sorry. It's actually from the other lawyer saying there's actually an offer on the table of $7,000 by somebody who's willing to buy the temple. All right, and so that's the kind of situation. So that's what I meant about, if not for certain Sangha members, the priests are gone, the temple members are dispersed. Some people are in Manzanar, some people are in Gila River, some people are in Arkansas from this temple. And the Sangha has been dispersed, but somehow the Zenshuji members' hearts were still trying their best to maintain this temple. If I could go to the next slide. And in this one, from Gengoro Nakamura, from one of the internment camps, he was one of the community leaders picked up early on, just like I mentioned, Reverend Yamashita, and these other people were picked up. He's in Santa Fe, and he mentions that he's there. What's the quote here? "There are quite a few Soto Mission Zenshuji people here in this station," meaning the detention station at Santa Fe. Bishop Ochi, Reverend Tachibana, and Reverend Yamashita, whom I mentioned earlier, Kenko Yamashita, are amongst them. And I'm writing you this letter at the request of the Soto Mission people who wish to be advised as to the present status of the mission in regards to financial status, to say nothing of the amount of the tax now due. And he goes on. By the following year, the message is coming through that we're going to put Frank, you and the board, if you really feel like you need to sell it to somehow, that's the only thing you have, then please do. But we would love to find some way to keep it. This is the kind of message that from all of these different camps, this Zenshuji Sangha is kind of trying to communicate with each other about trying to maintain this temple. And the ultimate end of the story is, of course, we're still at 123 Hewitt Street, and they were successful in somehow maintaining this place, despite this dispersal, despite the terrible, they can't make money during the war. How are they going to keep up the payments? Everybody just scrambled to sell whatever they could, to keep this temple alive. I'm probably running out of time, so let me go to the next slide, and maybe I can kind of start to wrap up. Another Zen priest here in Los Angeles at the time, he was just down the street, Reverend Nyogen Senzaki. He was also taken to Santa Anita Assembly Center that I mentioned earlier with the horse stalls. And ultimately he ends up in a camp in Wyoming called Heart Mountain. This is a sketch of him delivering a Dharma talk in his own barracks, teaching Zen Buddhism to whoever would come to listen. If I could go to the next slide, and this is what I want to end with. He wrote a note when he was leaving his Sangha to go to these camps. He wrote a poem called Parting. And among his membership, they had some people who, still mainly Japanese American, but he had there's a Latinx member, several Caucasian members, it's a kind of multi-ethnic group. And he says in this 2-stanza poem, "Thus have I heard. The army ordered all Japanese faces to be evacuated from the city of Los Angeles. This homeless monk has nothing but a Japanese face. He stayed here 13 springs meditating with all faces from all parts of the world and studied the teachings of Buddha with them. Wherever he goes, he may form other groups, inviting friends of all faces, beckoning them with the empty hands of Zen." I always think about this poem in relationship to a couple of the images that come earlier in these slides. I think about that family living in that horse stall up in Portland that put up an American flag and a picture of the Buddha, saying you can be both American and Buddhist at the same time. I think of people who persevered in their faith, making those altars out of desert wood, found wood at the mess hall. They just found whatever wood they could and assembled it to maintain their faith, persist in their Buddhist life, despite being incarcerated. I think of all the people who, when they felt constraint, when their freedoms were taken away, drew deep within, whether it's through meditation, chanting, all kinds of Buddhist practices, to help them have a modicum of freedom. These days I say, my little kind of formulaic thing, I have a kind of simple thing about, like, when people ask me, what is Buddhism? I always say, wisdom times compassion equals freedom. That's kind of like possibly too simplistic. But I do think that the purpose of Buddhism is about freedom. What people hear as Zenshuji Soto Mission from the very beginning is always about ultimate freedom. And that in the Buddhist tradition, we have two main things that we can draw on to earn that freedom. First is wisdom, meaning perspective. When people have been told you don't belong, how do you get perspective? When your family's life has been disrupted and the government tells you, even if you're an infirmed temple member, you're going to go to camp. Even if you're a little baby, you're going to go to camp. How do you get perspective? That's what I think is powerful about the stream of lineage and teaching and transmission that this community has gone through for 100 years, is there's perspective. Sometimes when nothing seems to go right, everything seems overwhelming. If we can get that one view, we can find a way to see past it to freedom. That's the power of wisdom. But then the power of compassion, that's Sangha. And I think that's what Zenshuji Soto Mission for 100 years has been. We can always practice alone, and there is virtue to doing that in some respect. But you're always stronger in Sangha. You're always stronger in your Buddhist practice when you practice together. And it's Sangha that comes out of a notion of compassion that's different than, let's say, the Christian notion of charity. Charity is about like, I'm in a more privileged or better position than you, and I'm going to help you. Compassion is, we are suffering together, but we also have joys together. And as equal peoples in Buddha nature, we're on a path together for liberation and freedom, that we can't do it alone. That power I always feel when I see those historical documents from mid-century Zen. Those things about a moment when this temple could have disappeared. The power of people in Sangha across different internment camps saying, we're still a Sangha, we're still connected, we're going to make this work, and we're going to do it together. And with that, let me close the talk, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Please stay there. So before Duncan takes questions, and we'll figure out a way to take the questions on Zoom as well. We'll unmute you all, and you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. Or actually, probably easier, put it in the chat, write it down, and then we'll read the question to Duncan. But before that, I have a few questions for you. And I very much appreciated the way you ended the talk. You have your rakusu on, and we heard the kind of Dharma talk message, which is nice because I usually hear more scholarly talks from Duncan. Two questions. One is very simple, I know, for you to answer, and you can answer it in any way you want. How did you write this book? How did you come to this topic? Because many of us know that you're trained in Japanese Buddhism, and your training really had nothing to do, at least scholarly-wise, with the US. And so how did this topic present itself to you? And the second question is about Japanese Americans and Buddhism. And what contribution do you think, you're a scholar of Buddhism writ large all around the world, but particularly in Japan, but I'm curious about and Buddhism in America as well, you've written on. I'm curious about what contribution Japanese Americans, in your mind, have made to Buddhism, Buddhist thought, or Buddhist experience. So those are the two questions we can start with, and then we'll open it up to the audience here as well as to the audience on Zoom. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Lon, for those questions. Just to quickly answer the first one, as Lon mentioned, I was born in Tokyo, Japan, and I didn't come to the United States. My mom is Japanese, my dad is British, so I actually have no family connection to this history of the World War II Japanese American incarceration. And it was only when I was in graduate school and I would come to learn that my teacher, Masatoshi Nakatomi, who was Harvard University's first professor of Buddhist studies, 1957, I started there in 1991, and I was his last student before he retired and passed away. And I came to learn about his family's history. During the World War II, he was actually in Japan as a young man, while his sister, mother, and father were in Manzanar. His father had initially come in the 1930s to Canada and served and founded the Raymond Buddhist Church. And then by the time World War II had come around, his father was serving at the headquarters of the Buddhist Mission of North America, or the Jodo Shinshu Nishonganji, in San Francisco. Later, that organization would change its name during World War II to the BCA, or the Buddhist Churches of America. But he was serving at the headquarters in San Francisco, the father of my professor. And he ended up becoming a very influential Buddhist leader in one of the camps, in this one in Manzanar. And if you go there today to this camp, former campsite, there's a wonderful interpretive center museum run by the National Park Service and park rangers. But you'll see amongst the kind of World War II era objects and artifacts that are left, because much of the camp was razed, obviously, after the war, is this beautiful monument. It's called the Ireto, It's in the cemetery. It's this kind of obelisk figure that has these 5 layers. It's made from this vision of the Gorinto, the 5-tier stupa. And it was made by Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi in conjunction with the San Pedro YBA, or the Young Buddhist Association, and a Catholic architect called Ryozo Kado. And they did it in time for Obon of 1943 because Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi had to spend so much time that first year. You know, those barracks were hastily built, poorly constructed. Many of the really elderly and infirmed and the young babies, they didn't survive that first year. And so he had to do so many memorial services and funerals, and he wanted to honor them. And so he built this tower, to. Ire means to console, re means spirits of the departed, and to. And he wrote the calligraphy that's still there on that monument. And when my professor passed away, I came to inherit, or I worked with the family to translate some of the sermons or Dharma talks that Reverend Nagatomi gave in Manzanar, and also parts of his diary about what life was like as a Buddhist priest. And I think that was, at this point, 20-some years ago, when I started translating diaries for that family, and then other families started to approach me with their Buddhist uncle or father or grandfather's diaries, and I started translating hundreds and hundreds of pages of Buddhist priest diaries during World War II. And what Lon said, you know, we all find our goen or karmic connections to different things, and that's how I found mine to the World War II Japanese-American story. And it was just, I could be helpful in maybe some of the translation work and that kind of thing. And then to do those right, then you have to learn things like what are mess halls, because in Japanese, like mesuhoru, and you know, like you have to figure out what is that. And so I began reading everything I could about what happened. And in terms of this temple, Reverend Kenko Yamashita, the former bishop of this temple, an abbot, did a wonderful oral history in 1973 that also became a very important source for me to understand how he and his family experienced what happened during the war. In terms of your second question, it's a big question, and I'm not sure if I can answer it right, but I think there's a hint in the sense of 100 years. Not very many other, you know, America does have probably, and here in Los Angeles, perhaps even more than America writ large, the most diverse set of lineages of Buddhism in one place, in one time, in any part of the 2,500 years of Buddhist history. It's not Kyoto, it's not Bangkok, it's not Shanghai, it's not, you know, Kathmandu. It's Los Angeles that has all of the Buddhist lineages, whether it's Southeast Asian, Himalayan, you know, East Asian, it's all here. And in that context of what specifically have Japanese Americans done in the 100-some years history of Buddhism in America, I think, number one, just persistence. When all the odds were against them, in a nation that said you have to be white and Christian to be considered loyal, belonging, that persistence says something. But in the course of that persistence, I mentioned some of those adaptive things they did in camp. One of the stories I heard there's another Zen priest who made a Hanamatsuri Buddha statue out of a carrot found in the mess hall, carved it. They didn't have the amacha sweet tea to pour over it. They had some Army C ration coffee, so they used that That's a very creative way of persistence. And if we look at that long history of Buddhism, whether it's in Tibet, or how Chinese adapted Indian Buddhism, or how Japanese adapted Korean and Chinese Buddhism, each histories has continuity, transmission, but also adaptation. And I think, writ large, in that 100-year history, there are now Japanese American Buddhists here for 6 generations. You know, that's something. And in that time, many adaptations have been made to be fitting for time and place. The Buddha himself taught upaya, skillful means, or I sometimes call it skillful adaptations, touching the person where they are in their in that time and space and mind space as well. That's the power of Buddhism, is it's supposed to alleviate suffering on a very practical and not abstract level. And I think one of the things that many people today that I talk to who are in temples, meditation centers, other places that don't have that kind of history in America, not 100 years, but maybe 30 years or 40, you know. One of the things I've noticed is that they look to Japanese Americans about transmission over generations. They look to Japanese Americans about even like places that began as meditation-focused centers that don't have any kind of history and it's all interiorized, privatized practice. They're like, what do you do when you have kids? What do you do when a grandmother passes away and have to perform a funeral? So going upwards and to the next generations, transmission, Buddhist education, Dharma school, all those things that come from being around for 100 years. That's important. That's important. I think another thing is that think about 84,000 as a project of translating the entire Tibetan canon into English, or the BDK project to do the Taisho canon into English. Like, there are big projects today to make Buddhism available in English, other languages that are not Asian languages. But every moment, whether it's Nalanda, think of those Chinese translators translating the Heart Sutra for the first, Avatamsaka Sutra. Like, do you keep certain words in the original Sanskrit and transliterate it, or do you translate it? These debates have happened periodically as things have moved, from one cultural context to another. And one of the beautiful things I think here at Zenshuji and what Japanese American historic temples have done is take the lead in terms of how to translate, what is the right balance between translation, transliteration. Are there some words, when I published this book, American Sutra, the Harvard University Press board, there was apparently 2 people on the board who didn't want me to use that title. They were worried that the word sutra was too esoteric and obscure, that the book wouldn't sell. And I had to make this argument that, today the word dharma, or let's talk about Japanese culture, like ramen and sushi, have become part of the English lexicon, that we don't actually translate that, right? How do you translate dharma? How do you translate nirvana? How do you There's some words that are worth keeping because they have their full, So that's, to me, one of the other legacies of being around for 100 years, is those type of things have been thought through many, many different times in terms of how things are chanted, translated, and these things are organically moving and changing over time. And so I could probably come up with more things, but just off the top of my head, those would be some of the wonderful things that comes from being around for 100 years.
Okay, so we've got some questions in the chat, but are there any questions here? Sunil?
First of all, it's a wonderful presentation and talk. And maybe I misheard, but you're mentioning about so the Japanese were mature, but from my understanding, I thought there was a small population, maybe 11,000 German nationals who also was interned. So my question was, if you could, what is the difference in terms of how those that population was treated because I guess they were more, I guess, closer looking to Anglo and they were Christian to the Japanese Buddhists.
So thank you for asking that question. What I was referring to was the major difference between how the German American, Italian American, and Japanese American communities were treated by the intelligence agencies and the US government at the time. Snow raises an important point, which is that in the arrest period right after Pearl Harbor of persons deemed community leaders who were somehow classified by the intelligence agencies as a threat to national security. There were Germans who were leaders of it was called the American Bund, but it's a kind of Nazi organization inside of the United States. They had big rallies at Madison Square Garden and so forth in New York, and they arrested many of the leaders of the Bund, and then those who were very close affiliates of Mussolini's fascist government. They arrested Italian nationals as well. The big distinction is that in that process, everyone who was arrested got a parole hearing, right? They got each person was investigated, went in front of a parole board, and you would have one of two choices. Either you'd be reviewed and then, arrest, because you were picked up, it's true, quite a few thousands of Germans and Italian nationals, not German Americans or Italian Americans, but non-Americans were picked up. But almost all of them were paroled out immediately after the hearing. And so, and among Japanese nationals who are like Reverend Yamashita here, he also had a parole hearing because he was arrested in that part's legal. You know what I mean? When a country's at war, every country under the Geneva Convention at the time is allowed to detain people that they suspect of being, a threat to national security. But you're supposed to have legal counsel, you're supposed to have a hearing and adjudicate it as to whether you're going to be continually interned or paroled and released. And most German and Italian nationals that were picked up were paroled and released. People like Reverend Yamashita, they were in these camps until the war ended. Actually, until after the war ended. But the bigger distinction is, I mentioned, the citizens. 2/3 of the temple members here, as well as the Japanese American community as a whole, were U.S. citizens. They didn't arrest German Americans, they didn't arrest citizens. But for the Japanese community, 2/3 of the people they arrested, and this time without trial, usually for citizens at least. The Constitution says, under due process, that you get, whether it's a jury of your peers or otherwise, some kind, like before you're imprisoned, you have to be charged with a crime. And you have to have some process that determines your guilt. So what was this group guilty of? What crime were they in fact charged with? And what we find out is, in fact, there was no crime they were charged with, and there was no trial. But they were put it. So that's the distinction. All right, does that make sense?
So if you can you read that, Duncan, online from Dorothy? Please give details on how the funds were gathered to pay taxes and mortgages for the temple during the war. Did any white Americans help?
So my understanding is that people like Frank Kuhara and other board members and other people from, as I mentioned, different camps were able to pool some monies together and send it to the lawyer who is dealing with that mortgage issue, who is dealing with the vandalism and replacing the locks and all those type of issues was being dealt with by this one company. That lawyer himself, in a different document, offered to pay, to kind of like just put up $500 of his own personal funds to help out. And so there were some people who were not Japanese Americans who helped out in terms of this temple. There were other temples here in Los Angeles, like the Senshin Buddhist temple, I think some of you may know, here in LA, where there was a African-American gentleman called Roy Loggins who, when that temple was being, during the war, it was a white American, Julius Goldwater, that was protecting the temple. It wasn't a law firm, but it was an actual Buddhist priest of European background who was protecting it. And after the war ended, this African-American gentleman, because people came back and there was a lot of racism, people wouldn't rent to Japanese, wouldn't give them jobs. So this guy who ran a catering company for the Hollywood, studios, he's African-American, he often brought food to the temple. He gave people jobs in the catering industry and things like that. So I think that's one of the other stories to remember, whether it's people of different racial backgrounds who are not Japanese American. Obviously, some of them were not welcoming of the Japanese American population, but some were very, very helpful during this very challenging time. And I think that's what I kind of why I wanted to end with that poem of Nyogen Senzaki about the empty hands of Zen, the open hand, the kind of welcoming hand of people meditating with people of all faces, that vision of America, that's one about multiplicity of peoples in Sangha together. So I think I appreciate that question because it points to something about what does it mean to be in an American Sangha.
Are there other questions in here? There is one more question online, Duncan, and I think can you read the Pasquale? At my age, I am aware there were, are, and will be horrible injustices done by man to other men. There are atrocities that are very unjust. Can you see any modern parallels on the world stage? And if so, what are they and what can we do to change that? I guess parallels to the internment.
So one of the people I really look up to in terms of analysis about this type of thing is a Buddhist priest who belongs to the Nishihonganji tradition, Reverend Kyoshiro Tokunaga. He served the San Jose Buddhist temple for a long time, and he was one of the first, actually only person who was interned in one of the Department of Justice camps who joined a lawsuit after the war by a group called NCJAR, National Coalition for reparations, redress and reparations, Japanese American reparations, and he used this analogy called it's not just that individuals have karma, but that nations have karma. And I've always been impressed. He said he came up with that idea when he was first arrested by the FBI as a Buddhist priest. He was on a train, he was feeling very unwell, and an African-American train porter came to help him and kind of help nurse him back to health, not just physically, but they began talking about what their respective communities had undergone. And he said that always, that kind of act of solidarity, or that act of kind of one person seeing something in another person, that was powerful. But he says, when we think about all of these, I think the questioner said acts of atrocity, it's not like the World War II thing is unique or the first time. There's many generations of enslavement genocide, in American history, we certainly don't need to point to only the World War II Japanese-American experience. And some of those things, we talked about the wall going up on the, about fears of migrant, this time from Central America, or the Muslim ban, about fears of Muslims after 9/11. Some of these things on race and religion, they seem to reappear in an enduring way. And so the question is, how do we inherit that karma of a nation where the work undone in one generation gets imprinted on the next? And for me, that's a kind of Buddhist analysis, you know what I mean, of like how, whether we like it or not, we inherit stuff that our ancestors left for us, both the wonderful things, but also the difficult things. And we have to, in our generation, tackle that. And so I'm going to quickly try to answer this question with a kind of global example. But let's think about our own culpability as Buddhists sometimes. There's a good Buddhist example of the same type of dynamic that I've talked about what the World War II US government was doing. Let's think about somewhere like Myanmar or Burma, where one of the leading parties, a Buddhist-led party, its English translation of its name is called the Party for the Protection of the Purity of Race and Religion, meaning the Burmese people as a race, and religion meaning Buddhism. And it's an ideology that's meant to exclude the Rohingya minority population that happens to be Muslim, right? As being not Burmese, not welcome in the nation. And that leads to political persecution, even genocide, imprisonment, deportation, family separation, all the things that happened to Japanese Americans back then. We can see a different mirror in a, predominantly Buddhist context. And so what's the ideology underneath that? That's the problem. I always think it's about purity, trying to protect some set sense of what identity and belonging, or how that needs to be defined. And I think one of the beauties of the Buddhist tradition is that it teaches us that there is a world in between categories of these kind of set, pure, siloed phenomenon. That our freedom comes from that world in between, the middle way, not on one extreme or another, not about protecting one solid identity, but that the Buddha taught how identity is in fact a beautiful dynamic thing. Impermanent is one way to put it, but I always think of it as beautifully dynamic. And if we take that point of view, we might have some chance at alleviating some of the karmic inheritances that we receive from just generations of different kinds of exclusion based on this idea of purity and supremacy, whether it's based on racial supremacy or religious supremacy. And I think Buddhism, has a beautiful message about how we don't need to take that kind of position, how we can stay in the middle, how we can stay in between, how we can find our freedoms by connecting people, by having compassion that's not about feeling superior or supreme over anybody else, but that we're in this project of freedom together.
Last question, Duncan. It's from Bruce from Minnesota, and I'm going to summarize it. It says, Latinos have suffered in the U.S. too. Why is there so little representation of Latino Americans in Zen centers throughout America? Zen centers in America are overwhelmingly white-dominated in every respect. You are in Los Angeles right now, and Zenshuji is an exception to that trend.
So that's a great question in the sense of demographic change, isn't it? It used to be that race in America was very much always talked about in the kind of binary of black and white. But here in California, by 2030, according to the Labor Department, this is going to be a majority Asian and Latinx state and a minority black-white state. So what does that mean for our sanghas? It's true that maybe some of our historic Japanese American temples and Zen center, it could be that it's not reflective of that demographic change to the extent that some of our colleagues in, for example, Orange County Buddhist Church, not that far away from here. My understanding is almost a quarter of its members. It's a historic Japanese American temple as well, with nearly a similar number of years of history, but a quarter of its membership is Latinx. Of course, across the street on First Street, Nishihonganji Temple. It's not just about the membership, but the head, the Rinban, the head of the temple is Mexican American. So of course, I think there is change happening that reflects some of this, and some lineages maybe like going faster at that than others. But I think it's going to be the case that just like that demographic change is one kind of reflection. I think the other big 2020 census data has shown is that the huge rise of mixed marriages and mixed race peoples in America, including here in California. And that's certainly true, isn't it, here at Zenshuji, in terms of the kids that come to temple, how many of their parents are from very many ethnic backgrounds. And so it's true. I think the temple needs to be a place that's open. What Senzaki was saying, that open hand of Zen. Open hand means it's welcoming to all peoples. And the next 100 years, let's see what Zenshuji does.
Thank you so much.